Next keynote speaker to be up. Before I go ahead with an introduction, just allow me a minute to just check if she's around.
I am here.
Okay. Hi, Maaret. Okay, thank you. Okay. Maaret is a principal test engineer at Vaisala. She is an exploratory tester extraordinaire, and she had been awarded with 2 prestigious global testing awards: the most influential agile testing professional person 2016 and Eurostar Testing Excellence Award, and selected as the top most influential in ICT in Finland. And as I'm already aware that she comes with 25 years of experience, more than 25 years of experience, and she has taken more than 400 sessions in across more than 25 countries. Am I right? Welcome on board, Maaret, and it is great to have you as a keynote speaker today. Today, she'll be speaking to us on topic targeting errors on omission. Over to you, Maaret. Stage is all yours.
Hopefully you now see my screen and everything is fine in that sense.
Yes, we can see us.
All right. Just set things up a little bit more now. Should be better for me. So it's an early morning for me, especially when I'm always oriented in the idea of Saturdays are days off. And I'm still very happy to be here with you because all of these Agile Testing Alliance, Global Testing retreat days, they feel like a place where I'm always coming home. It's an enthusiastic community, a lot of conversation, a lot of kind of, ideas pinging back and forth in the channels. And it is, even if I'm feeling a little tired sometimes, it is very energizing to see how engaged this community is. So with that sentiment, I think it's a very great honor for me to have this moment of speaking to you all on the idea of errors of omission. So just looking at the kind of the description that there was just a moment ago on me, I realized just looking at it, something that I of course see because of knowing what I should have written there is that it's clearly 2 years old. I think this is now my talk number 510. So in a few years, there's been more than 100 extra talks. I have only covered 3 new countries since I have written that text. And around some of the awards or recognitions, they still consider me one of the top 100 influential in Finland, not only in 99, 2000, but also in 2002. 2022, I mean, which is this current year. So it was just coming out recently that they still consider that I am doing something relevant, at least in the context of my own community and own country. It's really easy to kind of, see people who are visible. And it's easy to see problems that are visible, but it's not always easy to see people or particularly see problems that we didn't expect to be looking for. And a lot of times for us as testers, one of the core problems we have is that we are expected to somehow make sense of the world, make sense of the applications in a way that we also see things that no one else sees. There's this general saying of, testers, we don't break software, we break illusions of people. And I would love to think that everyone in the world is breaking illusions around the things that we expect of software quality, that it's no longer testers who test, but it is everyone who tests. And that testing is way too important to be left just for the testers. But I still feel like even with all of us in Agile teams doing our very, very best on the quality and seeing all of the things we need to have a conversation on, there are still things that require focused thinking, focused time in just considering what's going on. So that the general capability or the time that testers particularly invest in this type of information still brings in extra value. When we talk about errors of omission, what I kind of, sorry, this is not working, my thing. Now it works. So what I kind of look at is that sometimes, some of my managers have told me things like this. You have a colleague there, maybe even naming the colleague, and they're working, through so many tests a day. Like, they get 28 tests covered every day. And it seems like, Maaret, you are so slow. You're so slow because, like you've only marked 1 test completed today and only 2 tests completed yesterday. And especially in the earlier days of my career, this was a conversation I needed to have a lot more than I need to have these days, that when we're turning things into numbers, people are looking at those numbers as in a comparison, and then we need to have the conversation of what's missing. What happened with the manager in those days is kind of, and the colleague that I was compared to, was this basic idea that, sometimes you work with systems where error messages are frequent. This is a picture from one of those projects where error messages back in the days for me was very frequent. And in terms of seeing big visible error messages, if that is way too easy to do or very easy to do, you don't actually have to necessarily cover much of the ground in terms of how many tests you're running. You're just basically using all of your time in just getting the system up and running and reporting how many different problems you're seeing. And they might be these big visible error messages. But when you get away from these big visible error messages and the quality of the system improves, then you actually have to figure out how to do the testing so that the only thing you're looking for is not these big visible error messages. So looking at kind of what was I doing versus what was my colleague doing. We were doing, back in those days, we were doing installation testing. And I had a very kind of like versatile theory of what does an error look like that I would look for. I would compare side by side the files and make sure that the right files were updating. I was looking at features that were supposed to be new, that they were actually present after installation, making sure that everything in the installation worked as I would expect, also for the latest version. Whereas my colleague had chosen that since we are doing installation testing, basically what we do is running an installation, seeing if there's any visible error messages, and then running forward. So not really looking for anything other than obvious. And this was an inspiration to me in the sense that, we have very different things inside our heads as testers. We're looking for very different things. And generally, what I find myself looking for is kind of what's missing. So the errors of omission, already as a title, it kind of means that I am saying something must be missing here. So you can now kind of look at this and you can write, maybe for honesty and openness purposes, you can write in the chat what you think is missing here. You have 4 numbers. Something clearly is not there in the white space, in the empty space that we have in between. It might be that the arrow that I point there into the middle, it kind of leads our ideas into saying, let's, just pinpoint and focus here. But as testers, it might be also that there's missing things on the right-hand side or on the left-hand side of this image or the numbers that I've written down here. And obviously kind of like, it's easy to jump to conclusions. So we can very easily think that what's missing in between is one number, because 1, 2, 4, 5, it almost screams to all of us that the number 3 is missing in between. But actually, what I was trying to illustrate with this is that, we are looking at the clock, we are looking at the time, and we need the whatever divider into our clock, and maybe that is what we had missed in the center. So if we have no requirements, how are we supposed to know what's there? So we can generate this versatile ideas of what we are putting in between these two sets of numbers. But also we need to start those conversations of, is this what we're missing? Is this still relevant? And the world around us, kind of like understanding what's the context of the problem we are trying to find conversations on. I try nowadays to avoid the word bug very often, because I feel like everything that could bug a user, that's a bug. But what is actually the impact of a bug, or a thing that we would call as testers bugs, is that we need to start a conversation. And the conversations very rarely are best started by writing a report and then running away. They're rather conversations where we as testers are supposed to be present and have a dialogue, kind of like ping pong back and forth on the understanding, and share more of the context from why are we bringing out these type of conversations. So we look for things to start a conversation on. We look for a versatile set of ideas on how we would have these conversations. And it's not an easy job. The job that we try to do, it's kind of like steganography, like you have invisible ink, you've written things with invisible ink, and you have an empty paper that you're looking at, and then you're wondering, like, why would anyone give us this empty paper? And you need some kind of a mechanism. Maybe it's ultraviolet light for invisible ink, or maybe it is lemon juice that you need to put on top of the paper for physical invisible ink. But in terms of testing, like, you can think of it as like we have this listing of problems, listing of conversations we haven't yet had with our teams. And no one can give us a complete list of those conversations that we need to have. But we have that paper, that invisible ink filled paper, and we need to build the tools in order to make that invisible ink visible. The tools meaning it's us being the tools, it's us building tools for us as testers to be better, and make the bugs, the conversations, thus visible. I've been doing this exercise with a lot of groups recently, where I take a very small program. It's called ePrimer. It's been created by Evil Tester, Alan Richardson in UK. And what I like about that particular problem is that I used to say catch 22. I know of 22 problems. Nowadays, I know of 24 problems, so it's not now catch 24. But I have that paper with invisible ink that I can start with, and I can visualize the end result that we have in testing, making all those conversations visible. I've made hundreds of people do that little exercise, and I've noticed a pattern in how we do that particular exercise. We are usually able to reveal between 2 and 8 problems before we are calling it done. So very small percentage of the conversations I would expect us to have to turn that invisible ink visible are being had out of the experience that people with a tester background, with a tester job, even long-term jobs in testing are doing. And this has led me into kind of realizing that we still have generally a very big need in teaching and training ourselves in the ways that we turn the bugs, the problems, the conversations visible, and make them happen in our projects. So an important thing. The invisible ink I think of it kind of like, in terms of simple concepts. I think of it as our job is to find something that the others may have missed. And since testing was too important to be done just by testers, it's something that everyone must nowadays in agile projects in particular, well, any projects must participate. We need a way of bringing out those pieces of information that we don't yet have. So in order to find some of what others may have missed, I'm trying to kind of illustrate it with these kind of concepts. If we are looking at a project that we think is successful, particularly successful in terms of having the right conversations, having them at the right time, with the right kind of cost, having all of our stakeholders happy, delivering on schedule, delivering on the scope that we are understanding, not maybe what someone is wishing for, not something that someone is requiring, because asking is cheap, delivering is where the expensive work needs to be done. But having that level of kind of like good quality, solid quality information where your stakeholders are happy, they're even maybe delighted of how well you're keeping your promises, how well your promises of delighting people rather than giving them problems are happening. This is the level we generally would target. Anything underneath this, that's the listing of what I now call bugs, invisible ink, something we need to make visible. I find myself often working in teams nowadays, with teams where I would call it maybe a good team's output. Like the quality information is quite nice already. We feel like developers are already doing a decent job in testing themselves. There's a heavy emphasis on automating and documenting with automation while we're building the applications. There's testers in these teams. Generally, I am in these teams as well, working with the teams. And we are able as a team to produce a fairly decent level of quality. But you can still see that I've drawn this gap here. And I've drawn this results gap here to kind of illustrate how my work feels in these kind of teams as a tester in that team. It's not like I would be jumping to write a bug report or jumping to have a conversation every single day. I don't have to manage long lists of bugs. I get to work in a space where the starting point of my day is that on our list of bugs, we have 0 bugs because we have a 0 bug principle. Whenever we find a bug, we fix it, we address it, we do the necessary actions, even if it came from the production. And we have a general rule of whenever it grows over 20, even coming out from millions of users, we've had these rules in place, that it can never go above 20, or we have a stop the line principle, where the entire team will work on getting the number again very close or at 0. But instead of jumping at every single thing coming from customers, where some of them are sometimes kind of like, understanding mistakes as well, we have used this number 20, where we have this stop the line principle, because that's clearly when the entire team for us has needed to jump on it. But my sense of things when I find things in this space is that there's a surprise. It's a surprise that I even need to find many of the things. And if you were measuring as a manager, if my managers were measuring me in terms of how many bugs I find, or how many test cases I complete, they would generally be very disappointed in me, because sometimes, well, actually a lot of times, it takes me a significant amount of time to think in terms of how we use the software, what kind of conversations do we need to have with the team before I can report the bug, because I've been working so hard with the team on having the conversations early on. But there is still this gap. And I absolutely love working in teams where the level of quality is this. And most of the bugs that I have to then find are what I would call errors of omission, something we didn't even think about having a conversation on, but it came to my mind because I had the permission to use all of my mind, energy, excitement, energy, and focus on figuring out what is still that information that we might be missing, what might be included in that results gap, digging in deeper in the integration or intertwining of multiple functionalities, and seeing realistic scenarios that we could see in production that could surprise us, and they generally do. So working in these teams, most of my work is actually errors of omission. However, in Vaisala, for the last 2.5 years that I spent here, it's not like all of my teams are actually like this. So I wanted to kind of have a bit of a reality check on that side. Some of the teams that we still work with in the industry might be teams with less than good output, and the quality information of why we think we're still doing sort of well is that when we look the other way, or when we close our eyes, it is easy to think that things are working until we look at them and we see that they're not working. Having a team like this as a tester to serve and to grow, I sometimes feel like the bigger results gap that I need to experience there is that it's a result from the idea that team is still thinking in terms of the kind of old world. Testers are doing the testing. We are always kind of, leaving the work for the testers. So the developers don't know the general quality because it's testers' job to tell about the quality, and telling is not the same as trying to experience it yourself. And from the point of view of me being in those teams as a tester, it sometimes feels like I'm a person who picks up pizza boxes in the sense that it's kind of like, going into a living room after having had dinner and pointing out at the pizza box that is in the middle of the living room floor and reminding that, yeah, we need to actually take that to trash. And that's not really the work that I'm looking for. So in order for you to have the energy and the focus to really seek for complicated errors of omission, you can't actually be in a team where your work is to pick up the pizza boxes and point those out. But first, like Anna Baik often seems to be saying, or have said in the past at least, is that sometimes as a tester, your first job to do is to fix the organization so that you can even do the job that you originally joined to do. So for me, ending up in a pizza box team, sometimes the best thing for me is to leave. I did that with one of the teams that I've been working for in the last 2.5 years. I probably will go back after they have now again owned development and testing without having any testers in that particular team. But they needed to do the baseline work of learning to test as a team before they could benefit from really having a tester that works on the higher level. So to make these things visible, you often end up having conversations around test coverage. Test coverage, I use usually a conversation model of 1, 2, and 3. So the primary thing I want to have a conversation on is this one, the results gap, the results, how far are we in terms of results? How much of that invisible ink do we need to still make visible? But since no one can tell us what's written on that white A4 paper, it's really hard for us also to talk in terms of results. So it's taken me a lot of practice to get to an idea where, I can just start that we can assume there needs to be, I can just say out of the cuff, 80 conversations in the next month, or maybe 10 conversations in the next month. I have usually some kind of an idea. I can't say what the conversations are, but I can talk about my progress in terms of how my understanding towards that coverage of unveiling the information goes. And again, doing mostly work in the context of exploratory testing. Automation is included in that perspective for me. Starting from kind of what is the thing that I'm about to reveal, and just having my own way of talking about percentage of how far am I with this plan that I don't want to write out in detail in advance. It's the best way for making space of talking about the coverage that really matters. The second level, the number 2, comes to the idea that we want, in order to support this invisibility, we want also to have some ways that are less invisible. They might not be as good in describing the scope of the work and giving a good percentage number to our managers and our colleagues in terms of talking about how far are we in terms of the work, but they give us a good approximation. So having those conversations around code coverage, requirements coverage, they are at least things we can calculate. And for me, knowing for a general fact by measuring nowadays that out of the requirements that we have co-created with the team and the management, product management people that we have working with the team, usually my best with the team ends up with 80% of the requirements visible before that stage of actually spending time with the product as my external imagination and becoming more creative. That 20% extra, it's giving me a lot more tangible way of talking about how much work on top of all those requirements there is, and also on the time that I might need in the team in order for us to reveal all of that information. So again, a starter of conversations, getting numbers of code coverage, getting numbers of requirements coverage, a definite practice I tend to be using in pretty much all of the projects that I work on. Sorry. The third number, 1, 2, and 3, is then 3 coverages that remind me to extend this a little bit further. Remembering that there's not just a single environment. It might be that you're doing a system that is Windows and Linux. It might be that you're doing a system that is all kinds of browsers, not just Chrome. It might be that you're doing an embedded system that runs on embedded Linux on that particular set of hardware, but even the hardware in your environment is getting new generations and needs to be considered a new environment in terms of testing of that particular system. So having different kinds of projects, environments, it's like a heuristic that generates a perspective that I need to do. Similarly, data is a perspective. So for every functionality, I can try it with many kinds of inputs. I can try it with many kinds of states. I can try it with many kinds of configurations, and making actively changes even in the same functionality with whatever variables I'm able to control, and thinking data in terms of multiple dimensions. And having mechanisms to talk about that, very essential for coverage. And then, of course, remembering that it's also performance. It's not just using for once after it's been installed in a CI pipeline. It's installed in my test environment automatically. It's not just testing there, but it's also the secondary environment where it can never be automatically installed because it needs to be uninterruptedly available, maybe for weeks, maybe for months, maybe even sometimes you would like to try simulating all the activity for years without no reboots resulting from installing a new system, depending on the kind of system you're doing. So performance, usability, reliability, security, testability, interoperability, whatever parafunctional aspects you have, you will want to also dig into those levels when talking around coverage. So all of this, it's kind of like we're working with negative space. We're working with whatever is invisible. And just looking at this picture here, it's actually very clear what that negative space includes. Sometimes, like if you look at, for example, for FedEx trademark, the image, the logo, noticing the arrow there requires someone once pointing that this logo actually uses negative space to show kind of like progress in form of an arrow. But in testing, what we're doing is often actually looking for, when we're looking for errors of omission and looking for that better coverage with regards to results, we are looking at that negative space and trying to see things there. So I had a few things kind of that I collected on how do I actually try to do this in practice that I wanted to share with you today. First of all, I find working with a lot of people that we have generally a tendency to confuse long and detailed with something where someone did a good and solid work. 2 weeks ago, one of my colleagues in my team, one of the developers, created a 3 A4 page long listing of how a particular feature was going to be implemented. And we got together as a team to review that 3 A4 pages of things. We had a 1 hour, 15-minute long conversation. And with the 3 pages for very small features, it felt like, everything was considered, everything was included. And we had, we left the room with quite big certainty that we had done a great job in now, detailing and considering what we were about to build. In the next week after that, when we started implementing things, we realized that, yes, amongst that long detail thing, there were things that we had missed. And actually, we would have probably had a better conversation in that 1 hour, 15-minute meeting if instead of writing 3 pages that we were looking at and kind of all of us nodding like, yes, it looks like a solid specification. It looks really great. We would have had just 2 lines describing what is the essential change that we need to have a conversation on. So remembering XP, extreme programming as a mechanism, and the concept of story, what was that supposed to be about? It's a placeholder for conversation, and the placeholder for that conversation would have actually helped us probably do better in this particular case, rather than the detailed preparation. So the detailed preparation, we then had a conversation on how we could have done this better. And we realized that the only way we could have done the detailed conversation better is that every one of us individually would have created our own individual review preparation, our own 3 A4 papers, long, detailed discussion, and compared them side by side. That there's this human aspect of seeing something that looks fairly solid. It's very easy to go and nod. And having done thousands and thousands of reviews of specifications over the 25 years, I think that test specification reviews are particularly prone to the fact that, yes, it looks like a test case, it looks like a thing we could try, and it is really difficult to have good conversations unless all of us come in with this individual review preparation. So as a sample, I just wanted to leave you with a visual of what really convincingly prepared thing that overwhelms people can look like. This is something I created yesterday evening with Irja Strauss. We had this kind of a conceptual modeling of what are the challenges of testing and how would we categorize them. And if you look at this and you try to figure out what is still missing, maybe you will look for the one thing that everyone seems to think is missing here, test automation. It is intentionally split everywhere here because I don't think automation and manual testing should ever anymore be separated. There's the part of code confidence that kind of mentions it, but when you have this many things already listed, it becomes really difficult to figure out what are the things that you still think that should be there. And unless you do kind of your own prep work, and then come into those conversations, or unless you co-create this, like we did yesterday, starting from an empty A4 paper, you probably won't notice the differences between the two different people. So in most sessions, I like, rather than starting with one person's good preparation, is to start with good preparation from one person maybe, but then an empty paper so that we can learn together while creating whatever outcome we were about to create. This leads us to the second point, which is that a lot of times in the work of not just test specifications, but specifications in particular, if we have misunderstandings, all of those developer misunderstandings, not the tester misunderstanding, but the developer misunderstandings, they tend to either end up in production or they end up in testing and us trying to, in that short time frame that we still reserve for finding more things on top of the early conversations, because in Agile, we really do try to front load these conversations where everyone is involved. If anything is misunderstood in a deeper level, it ends up in production, and I don't stop testing when things go to production. Actually, most of my testing, maybe about 50% of the hands-on testing time that I spend, is spent exploring in production so that we can improve the product incrementally for the next rounds. So I only need to find certain types of problems before we end up in production, because we're always implementing things like in small slices and taking things forward. So for this particular case, my recommended practice for the errors of mission is what I call a reverse review maneuver, which I kind of hinted at. Instead of those 3 pages long thing that we all kind of nod and look at and need to prepare ourselves, if we come to that conversation with that empty paper and we co-create those 3 pages, and instead of a product owner giving us the requirements, we as a team, we get to interview those requirements out of the product owner, and the product owner reviews the documentation of the requirements that we are creating as a team. I've been a lot more successful in building really good quality software when the product owners don't come with, here's your story, here's your acceptance criteria, but they just come with one-liner, and everything else underneath is being written together by the team. All of the examples, all of the acceptance criteria, they are not coming from whoever is ordering the work from us, but they are being reviewed by the people who are ordering the work from us. So changing the mindset, that's been a very good way of finding these errors of omission. Another one that has been very helpful for me is this idea of actively searching. So doing the prep work, what does that really look like? So if you want to see that negative space, if you do a mind map, for example, and in the mind map, you notice that it's all tilted to one direction, like everything that you're modeling, like everything that you're writing right now, today in your testing, everything that you're writing notes about is under one single thread there. And the other side of it is kind of like empty. It gives you a way of talking about the things you haven't yet done, and kind of visually also seeing that. but also it gives you a chance of kind of like considering balance in terms of how you could make all of that better visible. In the preparation, the spec of claims for me means that almost every single time someone else has given me, as a tester, has given me a specification, I will rewrite that specification from another perspective. And that helps me to notice that, you know, on my list and on the other list, there are things where these things don't match. I can't draw the lines between my listing and the other listing. And then that kind of helps me see the things that I'm missing. I'm seeing people raising hands. I don't know if I'm supposed to react to those in some ways. Hopefully not.
We can take up one question in the interest of time. Given the rush of completing the test, the joy of finding errors, problems,
I think Maaret session is
so
still
I'm
going on.
asking, do I need to? I have still a couple of more things that I need to cover.
Maaret, please cover up.
What's the expectation here?
You finish your session first. My request.
So as far as I'm looking, I should have 5 minutes, right?
Yes, please. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. So to complete this one, so create your own listing, compare in that sense. Pictures, create those. Visual modeling is a good way of doing things. So they usually say different things than texts. I almost always have something visual to work from. And here's one example from last Wednesday, working with what I call Testing Dozen, 12 complete newbies to testing, in us kind of like trying to figure out how ChatGPT, the new system for AI, how that works and how we would test it. Just, you know, visually putting in context some of the problems and examples of problems we were seeing, but also just visually looking at it. Kind of on the left-hand side, you can see inputs. On the right-hand side, you can see outputs. In the middle, you can see kind of the logic, the black box of logic. And you can notice that, you know, we don't understand the logic very much. We have some model of the outputs, but the model of the outputs is very much lighter. And the only control we really have is on the input. So it would make sense that the input space would be visually much, much, much bigger than it is currently. But when thinking in terms of kind of input, something processed, and output for your black box, and modeling both of those and actively looking for those things that can make those essentially different. Seeing that in a visual model makes you more creative in noticing the things you might be missing. So combining visual with something we do, starting from an empty paper rather than reading all the existing documentation, it generally helps us. And then the final tip that I wanted to kind of point out to as well, the reference, if you create or have something like that, the baselining, the idea of having something in production that is working well enough for production, it is a whole different world to work with from the perspective of omissions when you do these like small rounds. From, you know, it used to work yesterday in production. Today we are putting only this change more into production. The whole way of testing for things is very different when your continuous delivery system creates the reference for your testing to be the version that was already there in production and the changes you made to that. So baselining with continuous releases is one of the great ways of noticing omissions, because you get that small slice of change that you get to address. But of course, you will have then multiple perspectives, performance, visual claims, and the fact that humans are generally not good at noticing change. There's this example from James Lindsay, where you have like a picture and then there's a raster reveal. When you move your mouse around, the picture underneath is revealed. And in order to reveal that picture, if you're kind of moving in just one corner, maybe there's nothing of interest there. You need like broad strokes around the picture to start noticing patterns. But when you have once seen that particular picture and you have to look at the same picture again, it is very obvious you jump to conclusions much faster, and you're not willing, unless kind of like, actively taking the time and effort, you're not automatically willing to spend all of the time investigating the second time around. So creating some kind of automation baselining that helps keep you honest. It's like almost a way of expectation for me nowadays that I wouldn't survive without one of those. Just recognizing the human aspect of how I treat continuous change and having seen things multiple times. So knowing that I have a baseline where automation helps me is something that is very relevant in order to do things. So then kind of to summarizing, this all leads me to kind of, looking at documentation as something that I would rather not write in advance. I will leave documentation behind for future me to read. And I would hope that it's not 5,000 test cases like my current or previous project one of the projects that I'm working with right now has left behind. Because reading all of that is a bigger cost than anything else. But the documentation would look more like something like this, where it's code that you can run. This is a sample for testing a Roman numerals program created by GitHub Copilot. You needed to, I needed to, with a group, create the tests that I wanted to leave behind for Roman numerals and have those conversations of what do we care to leave behind, and which of these things maybe we would want to just, not keep running in the long term. Even including things like approval testing, where all of the combinations, numbers from 1 to 100, there's a test that tests for all of that. I could just as well also run a bigger scale of tests than 1 to 100, whatever design I end up making for that particular problem. So I've done a lot of work in terms of moving exploratory testing to the level of unit testing, moving exploratory testing to the level of integration testing, moving exploratory testing to the level of requirements conversations. And I've come to experience from that perspective that pretty much everything that does not need to be automated can get done while automating. But it might be that most of the time and effort that I personally put into the work of my team is actually not hands-on automation, but it might be pairing with someone on automation, or it might be mentioning the thing that I clearly see that we must be missing because we are still seeing a mistake of missing something, while I am spending time on testing with the maximum creativity in the moment that I can provide. And since a lot of the problems in production can be found in unit test level, I find myself actually nowadays doing most of my exploratory testing in pairs with developers, rather than just thinking of exploratory testing as something that is on a higher level. And some of the omissions, they're best found in the conversations of what's missing from the model and understanding of what the developer is implementing right now. So I wanted to encourage you all to kind of, go and look for errors of omission also on that space. So with that, those ideas, I want to still kind of like leave a brief moment for us to have a small conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Maaret. In the interest of time, we'll just take one question. That is, given the rush of completing test, joy of finding errors, problem, and defect is lost. How is that we can optimize the test coverage using the omission approach and bring back the pride of finding an error? So we'll just take this one question. We'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
I find that there's a lot of things we can do actually around that sense of rush. By just making some space, actively saying that we take a day here for finding something more. But maybe it's also some of the practices that you've ended up implementing are practices that I'm trying to avoid, like writing things down in detail. So some of that sense of rush comes from the way we've agreed to do things. So you might want to figure out if there's a way of getting away from that sense of rush. Like take control of your own calendar is kind of one of my general practices that I try to do. But also just, when you find that one thing, share it, talk about it, smile around it, and say things like, this is something you could have not, left intentionally, and share that joy of finding something insightful with your team. And if they don't share the joy of finding something insightful and exciting with you, it might be that you also need to reflect inside a little bit on, is the thing that you get excited, is it actually relevant for the business? That is something that I have had to learn over the years, that some of the things that I used to be taught as a tester that I'm looking for and I'm finding, they are not relevant in all of the different contexts. So also listen back to the reactions when you're sharing your joy of finding something. So make space, share, and listen back to the reactions, learn from those.
Wonderful inputs, Maaret. And I'm sure everybody has got a lot of inputs from the session that you have given. So this was a session on targeting error through omission, which was given by Maaret. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce Pyhäjärvi, right? If I didn't pronounce your name correctly, Maaret. So it was a wonderful session. And obviously, we will have a feedback that would be taken towards the end of the session, or you can give immediately after this, wherein you can give inputs and help us evolve better in the upcoming conferences. From here on,